Okay, Brian, we're ready. Arlo is on standby.
Sounds good. I'll promote him as soon as we get everybody logged in.
There you are.
Good evening, everyone. Apologize for our tardy beginning here. We had a couple technology issues. I'm assuming folks are out there in Zoom land. Good evening, my name's Arlo Stockham. I'm the City of Reno Community Development Director and Acting Assistant City Manager. I'll be leading the presentation today. Maybe before I do so, my colleague Cynthia Esparza can explain our system here on Zoom and how we're planning to take questions and field those questions after a short presentation.
Perfect, thanks Arlo. So the presentation today, while it is virtual, we are still going to have the community engagement public presentation feel. So after the presentation itself, if you have a question, there's two ways you could participate. One would be to raise your hand. So at the bottom of the screen, you should see a hand. And if you have a question, you could click on that button and we will be notified. The other way to see how you could raise your hand is there are 3 dots if you hover over the top right-hand corner of your profile picture. And you could also raise your hand that way. If you're calling in, you could, if you use #9, that would also raise your hand. So those are the ways that we encourage you to participate at the end. And also, if you submitted questions in advance, we will also be going over those questions towards the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Cynthia. So joining me here tonight are Angela Foos, Jeff Borkhardt, and Nathan Gilbert with our community development team. They may help field questions or may have things to add. Really the purpose of these virtual sessions are more presentations and informational. This isn't really intended to be, it's not very conducive to feedback and what may be considered kind of a classic workshop setting. So we have a roughly 30-minute overview presentation that explains, not in great detail, but in some detail, the amendments proposed with the code update. And then we'll open it up to question and answer. Please do, if you have any more detailed questions, or more importantly, if you want to provide input to the team, please don't hesitate to contact us directly. We've set up our Reno Direct hotline at 334-INFO, 334-INFO, to document and categorize the various questions and input we get, and we will have staff get back with you. You can also contact us by email at codeupdate@reno.gov, or feel free to contact anyone who you may know on staff if you just want to discuss directly. So with that, I am going to share my screen and begin a PowerPoint presentation. I hope all of you are doing well in the pandemic we're living through. This is a little unusual. Especially giving a presentation into a screen and not seeing all of you out there. I wish we could do this live in person, but that's just not the reality we're living in. So we're doing it virtually. With that, I'll dive right in. Well, I'll try to dive right in if my slides will advance. There we go. What we hope to cover today is a little bit of background on this project. It's been a multi-year effort and how we got here. The schedule and plan to make final amendments and move forward towards adoption. A little information on our zoning map conversion process and how we plan to handle requests for amendments. And then an overview of kind of a chapter by chapter overview of the draft document itself with a focus on changes of significance. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty details because then I'd really bore you and we'd be here for a very long time. But we do have more detailed information available for your review. Why are we doing this? In short, because it's a city council priority, but it's a priority for a reason. Implementing the zoning code update doesn't say a whole lot. Really, we need to implement our new master plan. Right now, the land development code is, roughly 20 years old with various amendments. It's pretty out of date. It's pretty difficult to use, and it's not aligned to the policy initiatives in Reno's new master plan. This also responds to other city council priorities, including the desire and need to increase affordable housing in the city and to streamline the planning and building process. For those of you out there who do building permitting and project approval, you may know that our code is more difficult than it needs to be. It's very long, and just some organizational and process changes will go a long way. This is also a priority implementation initiative in the master plan. In terms of implementing the master plan, this certainly isn't all that's needed to implement the master plan, but it's a big piece. These are the land use regulations. Listed on the screen are 8 citywide goals, each of which have policies underneath them in the master plan. And truthfully, the development code update touches on all of them. So you'll see these concepts of well-managed growth, of connected communities, safe, healthy, and inclusive, outdoor recreation, effective government. You'll see these topics embedded throughout the updated code. More specifically, we have area-specific policies in the master plan. There's a structure plan, that's the map on your screen, that lays out different design, I'd say, concepts at the master plan level for different parts of the community. We have design principles specific to centers and corridors, which are mixed-use zoned areas. The employment areas are non-residential primarily, and neighborhood areas. So we have some different development standards for each of these areas helping to implement the structure plan. And throughout the code, you're going to see the integration of sustainable development principles as reflected in the master plan. So at the end of all these kind of overriding policy objectives, we have this simple sheet of what's our goals here. Driven by the community vision in the master plan. That's implementing the master plan. Ease of use and predictability and transparency probably don't matter a lot to folks who aren't involved in using the code or trying to build things, but it's very inefficient how we are right now. We have a difficult code. We basically have a full-time staff assigned full-time just to answer questions about what's allowed and not allowed. And the new code, as it's currently configured, is much easier to use and also provides more predictability for landowners in terms of what types of projects they could expect to get approved and what design expectations the city has. So people would know better going in if their project's likely to be approved and what sort of design requirements they would have. Procedurally, we're about at the 11th hour of a pretty lengthy process. This has been going on for a little over 2 years now through a multi-step process, starting with outreach and stakeholder engagement, some conceptual meetings about the priorities, the code direction, what are the topics to address, what are the issues to address in the update. That was all completed in 2019. We did produce an initial draft of the code towards last fall and went through a pretty intensive review and refinement process. And now we are here with the updated consolidated draft of the code that we've worked hard to incorporate the feedback and direction received through the prior steps of the process. Our schedule is for adoption before the new year. Between now and then, we have a fairly incremental process planned out. We are here with public presentations and feedback where we're getting the information out and collecting feedback from the community. Many of you probably received a mailed notification. We'll speak a little bit about that. And then this type of information will feed into a planning commission review. We did a similar presentation, informational in nature, last week. And it's actually, they decided to schedule a special meeting the evening of September 17th, has just been confirmed for their review meeting for the first 4 chapters of the code, and then the remainder chapters would be on October 7th. Then those recommendations of the Planning Commission will feed up to the City Council, and they similarly will have an overview presentation and 2 review meetings. And then after all that, we should have pretty clear direction in what to include in the final code document, and we have adoption hearings scheduled in November and December. So as you're reviewing the document, first of all, let me thank those of you who've been engaged throughout the process and provided input to date. It's been very helpful. For reference documents, because this is a pretty intensive, complex document, we have what we're calling a summary of code amendments. That's a roughly 38, 40-page document that lists the amendment topics and the specific amendments compared to the current code. The nature of this code update, which includes significant reorganization, made kind of the red line track change approach to reviewing edits very cumbersome and difficult and not particularly helpful. So please use that summary of code amendments to help in your review. It's a lot easier skimming through 40 pages than the 650-page document. We also have tools that we're using to deal with the final round of input and revisions that come in. We are not planning to print a new updated round of the code before the adoption process. Instead, for final revisions and any outstanding changes, we have a table of revisions that we're going to keep building upon that basically lists those changes from the current document. So that would be adopted concurrent with code. While we are near the end of the process and probably don't want to open up entirely new topics, this is definitely a very good time for revisions and to weigh in on some of these key issues that are ultimately going to come to a vote at a policy matter from the City Council. So that table includes very simple cleanup items like typos and more significant changes as well. Additionally, there are a number of topics where various folks have interest in updating the code that just aren't part of the scope of work. It's very difficult to amend every regulation at once. So kind of through an incremental process, we're creating a much better framework for our development code with this update. But there's various other topics, whether it be short-term rentals is one example, probably additional efforts on affordable housing, some of our environmental regulations. Those are all scoped out to be prioritized by the City Council and addressed through distinct processes. So we have a list of those suggestions that following the code update, the Council will prioritize which of those to start on. We're also building a list of map amendment requests, which I'll touch on in a little more detail in the following slides. And following adoption, we're planning a regular 6-month review process to do any necessary corrections, fine-tuning once we experience how the new code is working. Map amendments. Amending the zoning map isn't really the focus of this effort. This is really focused on amending the development standards. However, there are some changes necessary to fit with the ease of use and kind of simplification of the code document. I've listed these amendment areas here. The most significant, well, downtown area is really the only area where zoning district boundaries are changing. It involves a conversion to the master plan district framework. There are 2 new districts, the University District on the north end and the Pounding District on the southwest end of downtown. that aren't currently reflected in either our old master plan or our zoning code. So those will get integrated into the code. Additionally, the new Riverwalk district is a consolidation of two existing districts, the Truckee River and California Avenue. So in terms of boundaries changing, this is the downtown area is the real focus for that, to come into conformance with the master plan boundaries. The other zoning map amendments involve the consolidation of our mixed use districts. For those of you who use code, you know that we have mixed use zoning pretty widespread in the city, in our centers, in our corridors, 4th Street and Virginia Street, and some other areas. And we have a very long list of overlay zoning districts that have different standards for, in some cases, very small areas. It's a pretty cumbersome framework, and it's also not entirely consistent in terms of the logic of what's allowed where. So there's a pretty significant consolidation of those overlay districts into some key new mixed use districts of mixed use urban, suburban, mixed use airport. The two Midtown districts are staying largely unchanged. And some of the overlay districts in mixed use areas actually limit uses to just residential or more industrial type uses. Those sub areas are converting to other standard zoning districts. And I'll go in where this is all outlined in the code. The other change of significance involves the commercial districts that are being consolidated into a new general commercial. We currently have arterial commercial and community commercial, which are nearly identical with just a couple differences involving location requirements along arterials or not. And then hotel casino is down. We really only have one parcel still zoned hotel casino, but it's basically commercial with a gaming overlay. So those all convert to general commercial. The gaming overlay is applied to the hotel casino property and also to other areas where the mixed use overlays currently allow gaming. And then similarly, our office districts are being consolidated. General office would convert to professional office. The only real difference between the two is general office focuses on large sites and kind of has larger scale development on larger sites. So we've added large site standards to the PO district and plan to rezone general office to professional office. If you're outside one of those zoning districts, downtown, mixed use, commercial, or an office district, the zoning isn't changing. Our employment districts, industrial, commercial, et cetera, are remaining. We are renaming industrial business to mixed employment, more reflecting what it is, but that's a name change. So those are direct conversions. Similarly, all of our residential zones, for the vast majority of people living in the city, if you're in a neighborhood setting, your zoning's not changing. Your basic standards aren't changing. Really what's changing are the detailed design requirements on each site. I'll speak a little more to those very targeted changes. But many of the questions we're getting as a result of our outreach have been, what's my zoning? Is it changing? And the short story is, if you're in a neighborhood, the zoning's not changing. It's the development standards that are getting targeted adjustments. Some of you received a map supplement with your notice of this process. Those were sent to properties that are either proposed to be rezoned on the list on the prior slide, or are within a 750-foot noticing radius of a property proposed to be rezoned. So you see two examples of this on your screen, kind of on the extreme end of changes. The example on the left is our notification we received here at City Hall at the river, 1st and Virginia Street. You can see basically all the areas. The boundaries are changing, the designations are being renamed. So you can see a lot of conversions taking place where one district turns into a different district. In contrast, the residential area notice, the map on your right, is for our fire station number 8 on Kings Row and McCarran. And you can see there's really only one parcel highlighted. What that indicates is that is the only property in that map area that's undergoing a rezoning. It's from arterial commercial within the McQueen plan overlay to general commercial. So these big white areas, that doesn't mean there isn't zoning there. What it means is the zoning isn't changing. We have no doubt that a lot of people in the community may want zoning that's different than what they have. They may also want different zoning for their neighbor. So our plan to keep it manageable and to give thoughtful consideration to those requests is really to keep that list of revision requests. We're planning to use a conversion table for the initial adoption where the new zoning that most closely matches your existing zoning would be applied, and then have follow-up hearings to consider property owner requests and also to consider some targeted areas where the master plan land use was changed a few years ago and the zoning map has not been changed. We plan to review those area by area to make sure that property owners are comfortable with it, planning commission and council's comfortable with it, and if not, to look at refinements to those designations. So that's all planned to be completed in the first quarter of 2021. In the interim, if you're in one of these areas with inconsistent zoning and master plan, fees would be waived to do a zoning map amendment in conjunction with a project application if you're ready to move forward before we complete this reconciliation. Also, and very importantly, following adoption of the general code update, we have planned and scheduled a neighborhood outreach process to really look at zoning map amendments at the neighborhood scale in conjunction with residents of each area. The city really hasn't done a widespread review of our zoning maps in quite some time. And there are some areas that may just not be properly zoned for today, but we want to address those area by area with good participation. So we're not really planning to change zoning at a neighborhood scale with the update. And if you're one of those who has a request of, hey, I live in a single family area, I'd like to rezone to multifamily, it's very likely that we'll recommend those be considered through this outreach process. That's likely to extend through calendar year 2021. We're planning to look at areas, kind of one area at a time, starting with infill areas where there's more development pressure and moving out from there. And while we do that outreach process, we're also planning to look at the overlay zoning standards, as well as infrastructure plans and improvements. If there's a priority sidewalk connection or some sort of capital improvement that's a priority in the area, we wanted to take the opportunity to get that input as well. So you'll receive future notification when this process comes to a neighborhood near you. Just wanted to explain a little bit our planned approach to zoning map amendments. But don't let this stop you from weighing in if you have recommendations on your zoning map. As mentioned before, we're maintaining a pretty extensive list of those so they can all get due consideration. So with that, I'm going to do a high-level overview of the code and then open it up for questions. Apologies in advance that zoning can be kind of boring. So I'm trying to not to make it too detailed, but wanted to give you good information nonetheless. As you're reviewing the code, some of you have been involved will recognize our tools for reviewers. We have commentary boxes highlighted in blue at the top of each significant section, essentially summarizing what's changing and what's not in that section. We also have much more detailed footnotes that are identified really for each provision of code that is seeing a substantive amendment. And please do use that summary of code amendment documents as you're doing your review. The new code is organized much more logically than our existing code, starting with general provisions, our zoning district and allowed uses. Chapter 1804 development standards is a biggie that has a lot of the design requirements for different areas of the community. And then more targeted chapters dealing with signs, with land divisions, historic preservation, our procedures chapter, and our rules and definition chapter. Boiling down the big issues, there are really these 10 key topics that have been the subject of the most discussion and debate and are proposed for the most significant changes. The first one, scope of amendments, is really what we are changing and what we aren't. There's a lot of interest in either doing more with this code update, or some people feel we're doing too much. Then moving on, and I'll touch on each of these as we go through the chapters. Affordable housing being a biggie. We have much more detailed grading and hillside development standards. Parking has a major reworking proposed. Landscaping, our site and building standards. Significantly enhanced residential adjacency standards. We have some updated and streamlined historic preservation provisions and some process changes. Chapter 1, very briefly, not a lot is changing there. This is kind of a foundational chapter. The significant changes involve nonconformities. And in general, it involves relaxing some of the restrictions currently required for improving a non-conforming building or use. So this would apply if you're in a building that, say, doesn't meet current setback requirements. Or if you are a use that's not currently allowed in the zoning district, but you are legally established. These give a little more flexibility for improvement to existing development and also replacement after disaster. So you could replace your non-conforming structure rather than have to redesign to come into code if you, for example, had a fire and it burnt down. Also in this chapter are the transition from prior regulations. The key provision there is a 12-month phase-in process being proposed, where applicants could select to use the new code or the old code, but they could not pick and choose provisions between each. It would be either or. And after the 12-month process, the new code would go into full effect. Chapter 1802 are our zoning districts. The biggest changes here are format and organization. Much easier to understand. Each zoning district is listed on a single page with a purpose statement, a graphic, and some of the basic lot and building standards, things like lot area, building height, setbacks, those basic dimensional standards. And these are all supplemented with the development standard chapter. The significant change here is the simplification and streamlining of our mixed-use zoning districts I mentioned before, converting the overlays to base zoning districts, and just having fewer different districts overall. In general, this is a pretty direct conversion where the new standards pretty closely approximate the existing standards, with two real exceptions, and those are in the downtown area. The new university district, the master plan calls for a more limited palette of allowed land uses. So things like non-restricted gaming or marijuana sales are currently allowed, but would no longer be allowed in that university district. That's for obvious reasons to better support the university and provide for compatible land uses at that interface. The second significant change is the Pounding district. Currently, there's no height limit there. It's really zoned much like the rest of downtown, but it's different than the rest of downtown. It's lower intensity, it's mixed residential, a lot of historic buildings. So the new standards call for new development that generally reflects the pattern of development that's out there now. And it's also identified as a conservation district with possible future development of architecture standards and other standards for historic preservation. Residential zoning districts, very limited changes. The districts are retained. There have been some questions about the naming. We're going to a consistent naming protocol where the number in the district name is units per acre. Right now we have all of our zoning districts use units per acre, except 3 of them. SF6, SF4, and SF 4 districts, SF4, 6, 9, and 15 use lot size terminology, and it's a little confusing. So the names are changing to reflect units per acre, but the basic standards of lot sizes, building heights, setbacks, those are remaining unchanged. So we've had a number of questions about that. The real targeted changes in the residential areas are some setback adjustments from alleys. When our alley neighborhoods were initially developed, setbacks were not required from the alleys. That's reflected in the development pattern. At some point in the past, 20-foot setbacks were required, so many of the homes are non-conforming. And we're proposing to bring back the 0-foot setback from alleys where they exist. Kind of along the same lines, currently we have a standard for increased setbacks from arterial roadways. That's proposing to be eliminated, and standard front setback requirements would apply. So those 2 targeted changes allow a little bit more infill development and affordability, but really pretty limited. We also have a proposed reduction in the building separation requirement for multifamily buildings. That really applies within larger project sites, how much separation is required between 2 multifamily buildings on the same site. So that's been being modestly reduced. All the other standards are essentially unchanged. Special purpose districts, there are some changes to our SPD, specific plan district, as well as our PUD, planned unit development district. I'll touch on a little bit in future slides. And our overlay districts, in addition to kind of the standard mixed use overlay district consolidation, we have current overlay districts for historic landmarks, mobile homes, and cooperative plan areas, which are really development standards just under a kind of funky organization. In the new code, those are addressed with comparable development standards rather than overlay zoning. And gaming overlay is applied for existing gaming areas. No change to the properties that are allowed to have gaming or not allowed, just kind of a different system that's easier to use. Next chapter is the land use regulations. This lays out the uses that are allowed in each zoning district. Like the prior chapter, the big changes are organizational in nature. We got all the land uses, all the districts and all the land uses onto one table, which is much easier to use and reference whether you have a property and you're interested in knowing what's allowed on that property, or maybe you have a use you're wanting to establish, a restaurant use, and you want to know what process may be required in each zone district and where it's allowed and not allowed. You can use this table much easier. For the draft code, we have some color coding to help reviewers see where permissions are more permissive or less permissive, as well as those consolidated districts. Pretty targeted. Most of the land uses are staying unchanged, but you'll see with the green and red shading, there are some targeted adjustments. I think I'll touch on a couple of those right now. These are really the high level changes in this chapter. Broader allowance for restaurants in our higher density multifamily zones. We have expanded allowances for home occupations with a public hearing process to do expanded home occupation, as well as open lot parking. Especially in our urban areas, we don't currently allow parking businesses like many larger cities do, and that's proposed in the new code. We have new use categories for uses that just didn't really exist or weren't common when the code was last updated. No significant changes to where those uses are allowed, just better reflects modern uses. We do have a new framework for entertainment uses. This has been a real challenge, whether it's a nightclub with loud music all through the night or a wedding venue. Proposed are live entertainment and daytime entertainment uses. So daytime entertainment is what it implies. It's during the day, it's more limited, separation from residential. but also more broadly allowed. Live entertainment generally requires a public hearing process. There are fewer areas where it's allowed, but that's where late night concerts and amplified music would be allowed. We have new provisions incentivizing improvements to existing mobile home parks. We have somewhat increased review thresholds for multifamily developments to help with housing and housing affordability. We have new location standards for auto-oriented uses like gas stations and drive-through in our downtown and mixed-use areas, generally focusing them near freeway interchanges rather than, say, a new McDonald's in the middle of downtown would not be allowed. Well, it would be allowed, but not with the drive-through. We have consistent outdoor storage standards. There's a lot of different standards in our current code. We have new vegetation management uses. This is really focusing on defensible space and wildfire protection and assorted other cleanup in this chapter. One of the bigger chapters that our reviewers probably should pay a lot of attention to is Chapter 1804, our development standards. It's organized from the ground up. So if you're planning on building a home or any other type of project, you'd really start at the beginning and work through this with your various design requirements. This is unchanged from the prior draft with two exceptions. There's a new Article 2 proposed, which is a standalone sustainability ordinance. And there's also a new Article 15 proposed for housing, kind of improved organization. Touch on each of these. The natural resource protection standards, we're really steering away from substantive changes as part of this code update, but just about all of our natural resource protection standards are on that list for additional topics to address, whether it's our flood hazard ordinances, wetland ordinances, major drainage ways, things like that. There are really three minor amendments here. We have kind of a weird glitch in our residential shadowing code where multifamily buildings can't build to their maximum height because they would shadow another multifamily building of their same height. So a very targeted amendment to allow shadowing up to the 45-foot allowed height. Flood hazard ordinances, we've been requiring by conditions of approval supplemental retention in our closed basins for flood mitigation. And that's being codified through this process. And there's a new source water protection ordinance that's intended for the protection of our municipal water supply. In effect, this is a notification process to the Truckee Meadows Water Authority. It doesn't create new regulations, but TMWA is very interested in monitoring potentially polluting uses and helping the state of Nevada ensure conformance with pollution protection standards. That's about it for Article 1. A little bit of language cleanup just to get rid of outdated language, but no other substantive changes. Article 2 is a new sustainability ordinance. This has received a lot of discussion through the process, how to balance sustainable design principles with affordability. Through the whole process, what we're narrowing in on is a menu-based ordinance where essentially each project would have to get a point total and various sustainable design features, each give you a point. So development would have to have sustainable design, but exactly how they provide that sustainable design would leave a little room for flexibility for the designers. This is largely copied from the ordinance that's been in place in Henderson, Nevada, and has been fairly well received from the input we've received. But there are adjustments up here to address urban infill development and affordable housing, which we didn't feel were well covered in the Henderson ordinance, and also ongoing discussions for additional refinement. We have a small group stakeholder meeting, I believe later this week, to look into refinements to that ordinance. Articles 3 and 4 deal with grading and hillside development. Somewhat streamlined development review process. Right now we rely very heavily on special use permit review. So the review process would be easier, but the standards are much stricter and more detailed, essentially requiring the things that we negotiate and require by condition of approval project by project. The biggies on that list are the new slope treatment standards, which really have limitations on how big the cut and fill slopes can be and how the grading is handled, as well as expanded hillside architecture standards. We got a lot of comments in the initial review process that it was perhaps too rigid, and there were concerns in the design community that it didn't allow for alternative designs. So instead of significantly relaxing the standards, we added a proposed provision for alternative designs to be considered through a public hearing process with a supplemental finding. So there's basic standards that really call for hillside sensitive design, and then a process alternative where applicants could propose an exception. With that, as long as they meet the enhanced standards, public hearings would not be required for the depth of cuts and fills or for hillside developments for projects under 10 acres in size. Larger projects on hillsides would still go through public hearing processes, even if they met the enhanced standards. Just some targeted changes to Articles 5 and 6, our street and access standards. Really making sure we have consistency with our Public Works Design Manual. Probably the biggest change is moving to 5-foot wide sidewalks in residential areas as opposed to 4-foot wide. That's being rolled out in conjunction with reduced street widths. So in general, slightly narrower streets and wider sidewalks in residential areas would be the outcome, and some other clarifications about sidewalk waivers. And then Article 6 has some expanded standards focusing on connectivity, both for streets and pedestrian and bicycle connectivity. These really implement some of the master plan policies about interconnected communities and improved multimodal transportation. Parking's a big one. Our parking ordinances now are difficult. Generally, we require much more parking than is needed or is industry standard today. But in conjunction with that, over the years, a series of exceptions or modifiers have been approved. And we currently allow parking analysis, a parking analysis for each specific project to justify lower parking rates in accordance with ITE or American Planning Association professional recommendations. The updated code really moves away from that, project-specific analysis to have standardized rates based on current industry recommendations, which are generally less surface parking than was recommended 20 years ago. We have a tiered approach reflecting the different areas of the community. From downtown, we're proposing to expand allowances for discretionary parking. So no minimum parking downtown would be expanded to all uses. That's currently in place for many uses, retail, restaurants, et cetera. But on-site parking is an impediment to redevelopment. This would essentially allow development to happen downtown with parking to be determined by the applicant. Level 1 are urban areas with reduced parking rates, and level 2 for the rest of the community are more standard rates. And there are also some transitional areas included in the code. And then a suite of kind of related amendments, expanding offsite and shared parking, and various other adjustments and recalibrations to reflect the new overall parking framework. Landscaping is also, has some fairly significant changes. The initial draft was pretty modest in the changes proposed, focusing on shade trees and a few targeted refinements. We had a group of landscape architect professionals form a committee and come together And they recommended a suite of changes targeted to enhanced tree health and tree growth, which really involves smaller planting sizes, but expanded requirements for tree wells, soil preparations, basically the conditions for healthy growth. And also enhanced parking lot standards as reflected in the diagram there. So hopefully we won't be seeing these giant seas of parking with insufficient landscaping. The changes to parking and landscaping codes really call for a lot more shade and better landscaped areas. Articles 9, 10, and 11 are key to implementing the master plan structure plan. These articles address the same topics, but differently. Article 9 is for our residential zones, Article 10 for our mixed use zones, and Article 11 for our non-residential zones. All of them have general standards organized with site layout and development pattern, things like streetscape design, building location, circulation and access requirements, and building design requirements. And then each of the articles also have supplemental standards for certain areas or certain types of uses. And those are largely retained from existing code with one significant exception, and that's the multifamily supplemental standards allow a density increase for projects with small unit sizes. This addresses a housing affordability problem where currently our code treats a 4,000 square foot condo the same as a 600 square foot efficiency. So for the more affordable products, units per acre is usually the limiting factor. And this would allow a few more units per acre for those more affordable, smaller unit size projects, as long as they meet the general standards for building height, setbacks, and those types of things. And all of these are supplemented with our residential adjacency standards. We have a new model ordinance for exterior lighting. Our existing code is about a half-page long and says very little. This deals with all the typical dark sky lighting standards, lighting types, lighting shielding, lighting levels, temperature of lighting. And then we have parking lot lighting standards with differential lighting heights within parking lots, depending on non-residential, mixed use, or residential areas, light standards for outdoor recreation uses, and some provisions for alternatives. Article 14 are residential adjacency standards, significantly expanded design requirements to enhance compatibility with nearby residential zones. So this applies to non-residential development, either within or within 150 feet of residentially zoned property. There's a somewhat streamlined process where special use permit review is replaced with site plan review. I'll discuss those differences in a moment. And there's also a targeted exception for small projects located across large roadways from residential zoning. This has received a lot of work and refinement through the process. And then Article 15, housing. Relocating our various affordable housing incentives to this location. Those are proposed to be enhanced a little bit, where the qualifications are broadened out for the incentives to help encourage more affordable housing. But this is also a placeholder for future amendments that may be adopted over time. Signs are substantively unchanged, with one exception. There was a recent Supreme Court ruling, Reed versus Gilbert, and we had two provisions we had to change to conform with that ruling to be fully content neutral. Our standards for real estate and political signs had to be merged, and our standards for supplemental signs for gas stations, we had to remove the language that only allowed the prices to be on those signs. Beyond that, we are keeping everything the same in the sign ordinance. We are proposing a more understandable, easy to use process using maps for billboards. Our current ordinance is very complicated. It was litigated, and it's difficult to determine where a billboard's allowed. So our map approach should make it much more clear where billboards are allowed, where they are not, and various special areas with unique provisions. I skipped right over 1806 because it's not changing. 1807, historic preservation. There's a very detailed implementation measure in the master plan, and a lot of work during the master plan update process went into historic preservation. And in effect, we've made all the changes recommended by this implementation measure. That is still going through review. There's going to be a meeting of the Historic Resources Commission coming up to do a final review. But in general, it's a somewhat streamlined process. It has some improvements in terms of the certificate of appropriateness process for modifications to listed historic structures. And it also has some additional protection standards with stronger mitigation requirements for demolition permits, as well as a process for review of projects adjacent to listed historic resources. So we could spend a whole meeting on historic resources, but overall, we hope it's an improved framework that increases utilization of our local register of historic places and better protects historic resources in the community. The process chapter is probably the other, one of the other biggies. I'm going to go over some of the high-level changes. Updated development review processes. You're going to see conditional use permits and minor conditional use permits replacing special use permits. Those are really for land use approvals. And then for site design approvals, things like grading, we have major site plan reviews and site plan reviews. Each of those topics have a public hearing process for bigger projects that are potentially more impactful. And then what we're calling an enhanced administrative process, similar to our current site plan reviews for smaller projects, where it's a quicker 30-day staff decision, but those projects are publicly noticed and appealable. So it's not by right, it's still a conditional approval, and all appeals go directly to City Council. We have two new processes for flexibility and relief, both requiring Planning Commission review to supplement our variance processes. Those are major deviations and alternative compliance processes. We have some targeted relaxation of development review requirements, but really pretty targeted. There's a lot of input on both sides of this issue. Process requirements add cost and uncertainty for projects, but they also provide a safeguard for people in the area to make sure those projects are good projects. So this is really the list of the streamlining that's proposed in this draft. And really all of these streamlining topics are done in conjunction with the more detailed development requirements. This all kind of gets to the overarching goal of more predictability for community members. We have a restructuring of our findings for approval that are more targeted to the type of application being proposed. For those of you in the industry, the site plan findings are a subset of the conditional use findings. So conditional use reviews involve both land use and site design considerations, whereby site plan reviews focus on site design. And then we have pretty widespread use of supplemental findings where alternative designs, sorry, I clicked too quickly, where alternative designs are proposed. SPD, specific plan district, is a zone district that's kind of a specialized district, almost customized, that was used historically. It was essentially eliminated a while back, but some state laws have changed and we're proposing to bring that back, but with more limitations in terms of the content of SPDs, the format of SPDs, and findings to support the use of an SPD instead of standard zoning. These are good tools to work out kind of compromises at a neighborhood scale, but can also be cumbersome to implement. So we hope this is a nice balance. And revisions to our planned unit development standards. really with similar to SPD's, expanded application and content requirements, but also a process for minor amendments to be approved. Provisions for reconsideration and revocation of planned unit developments in the future to make sure that old approvals stay timely and are still appropriate over the long term. And then expanded findings for PUDs. Development agreement text is updated. That's a code amendment going through the process right now. It's on our council agenda tomorrow. That text will be updated consistent with the final action. We have language generally requiring master plan and zoning map amendments concurrent with annexation applications. And we also have expanded documentation requirements for demo permits for older buildings with expanded photo documentation, floor plans, things of that nature. And lastly, rules and definitions. Really the changes here are to reflect other changes that I've described. Don't need to go into detail of those again. So I hope I haven't bored you all. It looks like I went a little over my 30 to 40 minutes. I hope this was helpful, and we will open it up to the question and answer process. And I'm going to stop my screen share, but please do contact us directly. This is a little cumbersome to do over a Zoom webinar, but we're all here available to answer questions, get your feedback, and make adjustments as we move to the final approval process. I think Cynthia is going to be managing the Q&A process here.
Yes, and we will actually go ahead and get started with questions that were submitted in advance. The first question is from Carrie Jensen. I don't know if I see her among the attendees. So we'll jump into the second question that we received from Donna Keats.
Hi, Donna.
And Donna is on.
All right, there she is. Donna, you're muted. If you can click your unmute button.
I'm good. Can you hear me now?
We can. How you doing?
I'm okay, thank you. So were you reading my question or my comment, or am I supposed to ask any of my 1,000 other ones? Or
could we could start with your question that was submitted.
okay.
Do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to read it?
I don't have a copy of it, so perhaps you should.
Sure. So it's regarding, let's see, there was a discussion about establishing criteria for standing, meaning who was allowed to appeal the actions of decision-making bodies. Staff was asked to propose revised language. Does that ring a bell?
Yep, I have it now. Okay, so
Perfect.
I have many.
Yeah.
But
Donna.
yeah, this is one of the ones you don't want to discuss at this time.
Yeah, we got the question, and yeah, there was a significant discussion at the council review step of the last draft about
I'm sorry.
I guess tightening criteria for who can appeal various
I
projects.
was there though. I heard it. The whole
We
discussion.
did. We are planning to have that discussion item together with the procedures chapter, but we are not at this point recommending changes with the code update on that process. It's one of those we're recommending, be considered as a distinct process. And it was a little unclear.
I'm so sorry.
If the majority of council wanted that.
I have this new puppy. Okay, so then I have a question. In all the previous, the current code and the previous versions about how, do I need to turn something up? Are you having difficulty? My dog.
If you could talk a little louder, it's a little hard to hear you, Donna, or
Okay,
move your mic
partly my
closer.
dog. Oh, well, wait, let's see. Microphone, well. Okay, I don't know, I'm really sorry. Anyway, and it's all about the definition of aggrieved person. Okay, of who can file appeals.
Right.
And the aggrieved person definition is changed in this current adoption draft. Has been changed, and it basically eliminates anybody who's not a public, who's not a property owner who can demonstrate injury. So it has gone all the way to what the technical working group wanted and said, basically, nobody can appeal. I can read it to you if you don't have it handy. It now says any person or persons or entity, blah, blah, who can demonstrate that their property is adversely and substantially injured by the action of a discretionary body. Whereas the current definition and the February review draft for the workshop version said an aggrieved person is one whose personal right or right to property is adversely blah, blah, blah. Didn't have the who can demonstrate, didn't have that it had to be your property that's adversely. So basically, you basically, it's as I said in my written comment, it's codified disenfranchisement of users of the city, and I really strongly object to that sort of process, which I think is in several different parts of this code, and that's one of the most egregious ones that I brought forward for this workshop.
We'll go back and look at the specific language. We didn't intend to change that section of code. My recollection was we were keeping existing language, but if things were changed, you know, that's, I think, a cleanup item that we'd be open to. Our intent was not to make substantive changes related to project appeals, who can appeal, the findings for standing. We are planning to have that as a discussion item when it comes back, but I'll need to look into the details. Thank you for bringing that up, Donna.
Okay, Arlo, we have another question, or I see a hand actually from Steve Topol.
Hi, Steve. You're muted, Steve, if you could click your unmute button. Thanks.
How about that?
We can hear you. Thank you.
All right, now we're talking. Yes, my name is Steve Topol, and I live in Lake Ridge Shores, right above the Lake Ridge Tennis Club property, which is now leveled and a big flat piece of land. My family, we originally developed all the Lake Ridge apartments all up and down Plymouth Street and up through Ridgeview Drive, and I was the owner and manager of Lake Ridge Tennis Club until 1994. The question I have for you is, I received a letter from Renovation concerning a rezoning of the all the CC zonings into general commercial. And I was just driving down from the lake, and I was just at the point where you're talking about the professional offices and the designations. I went out of service, and my question is that, are you changing the CC zonings into general commercial to allow a wider use of the property, or is it just something that you're going to gobble up into one giant designation? And that's the first part of my question.
I'll take that first part first. It's the latter. CC and AC zoning are almost identical. There's only a couple distinctions involving uses allowed along arterials. So the basic uses, densities, everything is largely unchanged. What would be changing in the commercial areas are the site design requirements for a more kind of pedestrian-oriented, interconnected design, a little less auto-oriented, but that's applying to all the commercial areas. So the consolidation is really for ease of use, because our two existing zones are almost identical already, and we didn't need two zones to do the thing that one zone could do.
Steve, was there a second part to that question?
Yes, ma'am. Can I just state it, and I'll get out of your hair?
Oh, please do. We're here.
Okay. Can you hear me? I just want to make sure.
Yes.
All right.
You're coming in clear.
Great. Okay. So the second part of my question is that the how do we the CC zoning that we have now was the result of a plan that was submitted that has been since pulled, and is no longer, it was granted as a part of the of this plan that was submitted, and now that's been pulled. Now, to be what my question is that, how would we go about reverting the CC zone back to what it was beforehand, because there's no planned project now. I don't want it to be gobbled up into the general commercial designation, as it says on my letter that I got from you guys last week or the week before. So is there a process under this development code, or the code, that people who are aggrieved, who have standing, can petition for a rezoning of the property back to its original zoning? Because Lake Ridge is a planned unit development. It's been that way since 1971. And there's no commercial designations for any property that are along McCarran Boulevard. The only commercial is located at one specific area, far away from the scenic, scenic way of McCarran Boulevard. So how do we go about under your new code? Where would we look to challenge that and having standing?
This relates, for other listeners, to a pretty controversial project proposal that was pulled down on South McCarran Boulevard. Really, the procedures for zone changes are not proposed to change with this adopted code. Zoning changes can be initiated either by application of the property owner or can be initiated by city council. So, or I guess planning commission as well. So for someone like yourself, essentially recommending a change to the zoning of another person's property, I'd recommend you chat with your council members and see if there's interest in initiating that. It is noteworthy that that prior zoning in that location was that SPD, specific plan district zone. Part of it, the adjoining part that wasn't rezoned, is still SPD. So that is a proposed zone district that could be used in the future for situations like this, where maybe the proposed use doesn't fit cleanly in any single standard zone district and some supplemental limitations are appropriate. SPD is a tool available. But short answer is that type of action would have to be initiated by the planning commission or council, and I would suggest the city council, because ultimately they're the decision maker.
Great, Arlo. We received a question in the chat. It's from Heidi.
I think I see it. I read the entire proposal and thought zoning requirements for churches was kind of vague. Okay, I guess, Heidi, if you're on the line, this probably warrants some further discussion with our staff. Requirements for a lot of uses could probably be characterized as vague. Really, the chapter 1803 lays out which zone districts allow churches, and depending on which zone districts it's in, the chapter 1804, the development standards, apply both to churches and other types of uses that are allowed. So in general, the design requirements for new construction are not specific for the different land use, but are more specific for the property. It's known as form-based zoning. We're not going entirely to form-based, but it's generally preferred practice to govern the design of development based on areas, not on the specific use type. But there may be more nuance to the question. If you're online and have a follow-up, that's great. Oh, I see you're on the Zoom. Hi, Heidi. Did I answer your question? You're muted though.
Yes, I just was looking to find, for example, if a church was a building, and it's unclear a lot of times if if you go to do the rental agreement, you find out they say it's not zoned for that. So I have a hard time finding where is it say that it's not zoned if it's that vague.
What you would do, is you'd use your zoning map to see what the zoning is. And then you'd go to the table of allowed uses in chapter 1803. And it lists out, I think we're calling them houses of worship or something along those lines, and
Yeah.
which zones they're allowed in.
I saw that, but then clearly there's more issues regarding parking and arterial versus collecting road areas and whatnot.
I might be missing it. I guess the roads, the basic development standards, you know, how tall, what setbacks, how much, the parking standards lay out how much parking required for each use. That's really all spelled out in chapter 1804. This may be difficult to deal with on Zoom real specifically, but we could follow up with you as well. Sounds like maybe there's a specific site in mind.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for participating.
Heidi, you could follow up with an email if that would be easy to codeupdate@reno.gov.
Okay,
Does that work?
yes, thank you.
And these are good exercises. It's entirely possible that there's, you know, some gap in the package. So kind of looking at specific uses where it's allowed, what the design requirements are. We've been trying to work through those as well. I see a new question popped up in chat. Curious to know if accessory dwelling units were allowed on residential zoning. If so, where do I find those guidelines? Some of you who follow zoning in Reno know this was a pretty controversial topic a couple of years ago. There was a proposal to allow accessory dwelling units more broadly in the city. That was not approved. So the new code largely perpetuates existing standards related to accessory dwelling units in that they are not allowed. There are a couple overlay zones. I can think of the Greenfield neighborhood plan area that do allow ADUs. There's a little nuance here though, in that a use called a guest quarter has been allowed for some time and continues to be allowed. We had a pretty good discussion earlier in this process, good arguments on both sides that we should have more ADUs or we shouldn't. And the council direction at that time was to keep our regulations the same. This may be looked at a future date, but essentially we're not changing the ADU framework with the code update.
Arlo, there's Thomas has his hand raised.
All right, bring him into the.
There he is.
Hi, Thomas. Wonder why. You're muted. I am reading your chat question.
Yes. I've talked to several, I own a property at the corner of Cranley Valley Road. I've talked to several other property owners on Cranley Drive and Southwest Drive. And our current zoning is MU UNRC. And if I'm not wrong, I looked it up. It allows a lot of possible developments, including several commercial uses. There's a little bit of restrictions compared to the standard industrial, but it's still very open. And the proposed zoning puts us back in MF30. And actually the big apartment complex just south of us in same block, they keep or even gain an MU zoning. And I was just kind of wondering why and whether we could keep our MU zoning also.
Yes, I'm glad you're here. This is one of the, I would say, challenging areas of the city in terms of our zoning framework. There are a whole bunch of sub-districts within the UNR center plan. It sounds like if you're converting to MF30, you were designated in the residential sub-district. and MF30 most closely approximates that. This is an area where the zoning is kind of a relic of a older plan where the university had planned to expand out to the east, which they're no longer planning. We've been in touch with quite a few other property owners in that area, and I'm pretty sure this is one of those areas where we're going to get a number of requests for different zoning and should probably look through in detail and revisit those boundaries. So I guess that's a long way of encouraging you to make sure you get your request into us. And we're certainly going to be having a process immediately following adoption to look at zoning in that area. If it was a mistake and this isn't a direct conversion, if, for example, you were in the academic area or general mixed use area, that's a correction we can do. But I think this is one of those areas. The other one is kind of the convention center area where it's pretty convoluted, the existing zones. And I think we're going to be kind of looking at that fresh once we get feedback from the property owners in the area.
Yes.
So not knowing your specific use, get us your comments. It will be reviewed with the other comments in that area. And I think making changes is certainly a possibility.
Carla, we received one other question in the chat feature, and then we can move into the raised hands. The question is, Amy is curious about ADUs, if they will be allowed in residential zoning.
Oh, I think I kind of answered that one. No, existing regulations are staying intact. Guest quarters allowed. Those are not allowed to be rented. ADUs not allowed. We can go into more detail, Amy, if I didn't adequately address your question.
Okay, moving.
What is that?
Amy, was there a follow-up to your question?
Where, I see it, where are the guest quarter provisions? Those are going to be located in chapter 1803. After the use table, it has, well, within the use table, that's probably the best place to find it. You can go to guest quarters and then it'll have a code reference on the right-hand side that'll take you to a later section of 1803. Actually, this will be in the accessory use part of the table down near the bottom. I'm actually flipping to it right now. I hope it's actually here. Yeah, guest quarters, it lists out which zones where they're allowed as accessory uses, and the supplemental standards are in 18.03.405I, as in iguana. And those are some clarifications, but substantively retained from existing code. And this is a topic of debate. A lot of people think we should allow ADUs more broadly. A lot of people are concerned about the neighborhood impacts. There may be a balancing of those with some future amendments, but not proposed with this process.
Carlo, I see two other hands. Donna Keats has a follow-up question.
Hi again.
Okay, unmuted. All right, am I there?
You're unmuted, Donna.
Okay, so for one thing, the way you just explained that, it kind of implies that a guest quarter could be an ADU, except it's not supposed to have a kitchen. So one might clarify that. I'll just throw that out there for the previous questioner person. But my question is about, well, right now, what's appropriate to ask you is I caught part of your sentence way at the beginning saying you're not planning to submit a new printed or revised something. You're going to have a table of changes
Yes.
What does that mean exactly? Before it goes to council or before it goes into code?
Before it goes to council, we're not planning to go back and redo the whole code and incorporate it in. What we're planning is for the final revisions, and we're just putting together our packet for the Planning Commission. There's a table, I think we have 25 items on that right now, that identifies final changes from this draft of code. That would be adopted together with code, would identify those last changes, and then all that would be wrapped into the code document for publication once it's adopted. So it's really just a procedural approach, so we don't keep having new documents and new documents upon documents to track the final changes.
Does that mean that by the time it gets to council, anything that's in here right now, like all the new stuff that went in there since the last time council saw it, then if they even realize it's in there and they say, oh wait, we didn't mean that, do it this way instead, then that would be like a revision thing that would all be turned into a final big thing that would be codified as a piece, not as a bunch of revisions to revisions?
Yeah, so whatever the change may be, whether it comes up at council or elsewhere, if they wanted to change language somewhere, it would be added to that list of amendments. The language change is identified in that list of amendments, and that would get adopted together with the code. Once it's all approved, it would be rolled into the final document.
Carlo, do you have time for one last question?
Absolutely.
I see Heidi.
Yeah, my question was, I had read through the whole proposal, and it talked a little bit about urban farming. And I was wondering how that would work because there's no area specifically. So is that on an existing property where, or is it a specific zone? I'm not sure I understand that.
Yeah, the urban farm is currently allowed as a temporary use. It's kind of a prior to development, you can use lots in a certain way. That is largely perpetuated, but there's also an allowance for applications for permanent urban farms. The requirements for those urban farms are in 1803.503I, and I'm going to go to that right now because I don't remember this offhand, the detailed standards. Urban farm. So yeah, there's a list, temporary principal use for a period of 3 years where they're largely allowed. There's some design requirements. And then to extend the use beyond a 3-year period requires a discretionary review approval through the site plan review process. So permanent urban farms would be permitted through that. So not really dramatic changes from what's currently allowed, but it does perpetuate the allowance to have, small urban farms that with provisions to not have the type of impacts associated with standard farming. Generally, there are vegetable gardens, flower gardens, things of that nature. No hog rendering, for instance.
Thank you.
Probably importantly, no livestock, no hoofed animals. You are allowed 12 fowl, chickens.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Well, happy to take a couple more if there's any more. For those of you still online, I really appreciate you spending the time. I know it's a little difficult over Zoom, but again, please don't hesitate to contact us with questions, with your feedback. We're all here and available to work through the tail end of this process.
Hello? Oh, okay.
Donna, it looks like you're still on. Did you have another?
Yeah, well, I'm a little confused about this process because at that, I was at the workshops at PC and Council in February. I heard all of the stuff, had the technical working group memo in hand, and the things that went forward and all the discussions. And there were a lot of things that were undecided at that point that they said, come back, go away and bring us some language and then we'll talk about it again. So I'm a little bit confused about this revision process because about whether or not, well, should I bother for one thing? Or what at this point, I mean, it sounds like, well, you guys are sort of considering this to be the final and it's just going to keep going through and whether or not making comments or pointing things out that, like things that got changed that you had previously told me, oh, it shouldn't have been changed, we'll change it back, but it's still not changed back, but we've talked about it 2 or 3 times, so should I keep talking to you about it? Stuff like that. It's like, well, where are we with this? You want the input, but are you still taking changes or modifications?
Yes. Yes, please, for everyone out there, continue to provide input just like you would. How we logistically organize that input at the end of the day doesn't matter. We still are taking input. Your feedback's still going to be heard at the staff level, Planning Commission, and Council. I know, Donna, you were one of those who reviewed in detail and provided a lot of comments. I know we made a lot of changes in response to those comments. I assume it doesn't address all of your goals, but we did try to make those changes. So if you don't think we caught it, please let us know. We can have a more direct meeting, probably via Zoom again, if you want to go through the specific items. Did make a note on that aggrieved party point you made that we'll double check on that because that was not a change we intended to do. But please, everyone, keep reviewing, let us know your thoughts. Really, public input isn't closed until final adoption. And we do have a list of amendments.
But what happens? You have the list. I've seen it. You compile all the comments. You put it in the packets for PC and for Council. I guess what I'm asking you is, at this point, is your staff still making any modifications to this document before it gets to PC, or are you just collecting comments to go to PC?
What we're doing is we're tracking all the comments that come in, and we're distributing those. A lot of the input we're getting are questions, and we're answering those, but where there's a recommendation or input or comment, we have a sheet, our comment sheet, that's going to be attachment C to the Planning Commission packet. And then we've done a staff review and we've made some recommendations for how to address those comments. So there's a separate document, Exhibit D, which reflect the staff recommended changes. We're running those through input from the technical working group. And ultimately, those recommendations will go through Planning Commission and Council. If some of our recommendations they want to change or they want to make additional changes or not change those things, essentially it'll be that amendment summary document that they'll be editing. So absolutely, keep the comments coming. We will review each of them. We'll make some recommendations. We'll address them where we can. Really, at this point in the process, we're pretty well guided by the high-level direction we've received on where the direction of the code update. So there may be some where staff doesn't support it. Keep advocating for that through the Planning Commission. And where we can support it, we will. And that's kind of how we're planning to approach the final process. Oh, look, I finally have a video. It's not just me looking at me. Hi, Jeff. Is there anyone else out there before we wrap this one up?
There was one comment. Thomas asked, can we consult the UNR sub overlays? I could only find overlay UNRC on the city website.
Yes, you can. We actually, our zoning was really difficult there and we cleaned it up. That should be now posted on our map server at reno.gov. It should also have been in your property owner notice that shows those sub overlays. If you're not seeing it through those processes, contact us and we can walk you through that, and maybe look in more detail at your specific parcel, kind of on a one-on-one basis. I know that's a challenging area from a zoning standpoint.
Carla, I think that wraps up questions.
Thanks again to all of you. Be safe. Have a good evening.